February 1914. The North Atlantic was already in a foul temper. Wind lashed the decks of the RMS Oceanic as she pressed westward from Queenstown toward New York. Snow mixed with salt spray. The sea rose and fell in dark, muscular swells. Passengers had retreated indoors, some pale with seasickness, others stubbornly watching the storm from sheltered promenades. Ocean liners were built for this. Oceanic was built for worse. She had crossed these waters for nearly 15 years. She had outlived competitors. She had witnessed the rise of Titanic and Olympic. She had carried thousands across the world's most unforgiving ocean. She was steady, balanced, proven. But sometime after 3 in the afternoon, the Atlantic changed. There was no warning signal, no visible crest building in the distance, no shouted alarm from the bridge. Just a shift, a shadow rising where horizon should have been, and then impact. A wall of water slammed into the starboard bow with explosive force. Steel shutters bent inward, glass burst across cabins. The promenade deck vanished beneath a roaring torrent. Passengers were lifted off their feet. One man, confined to bed by seasickness, watched a splintered fragment of steel bury itself into the oak frame, inches from his skull. For a moment, the largest ship in the world felt small. This is the story of that moment, of the Atlantic's reminder that innovation does not equal invincibility. If stories of the sea's forgotten tests matter to you, stay with us. These are not legends. These are recorded encounters, moments when steel met something far older. When RMS Oceanic entered service in 1999, she represented a turning point in maritime ambition. At 17,274 tons and stretching 704 feet in length, she was the largest ship afloat, a title that carried both prestige and pressure. Built by Harland and Wolff in Belfast for the White Star Line, she was designed not purely for speed, but for balance and comfort. Where competitors chased records, White Star pursued refinement. Oceanic's silhouette was elegant yet commanding. Twin funnels rose over a long, steady hull. Her promenades were wide and open, inviting passengers to walk comfortably even in moderate weather. First-class interiors glowed with polished wood, brass fittings, and sunlight pouring through expansive windows. She could carry 1,710 souls across 3 classes. First-class travelers dined beneath carved ceilings and fine chandeliers. Second-class passengers enjoyed accommodations superior to what many lines offered as first. Third-class families crowded her lower decks, immigrants chasing opportunity across the Atlantic. Oceanic became a favorite. She was known for her steadiness, an attribute more valuable than raw speed on winter crossings. Her hull proportions and structural integrity made her remarkably resistant to excessive rolling. Passengers prone to seasickness often preferred her over faster, more temperamental liners. Even after Titanic and Olympic eclipsed her in sheer size, Oceanic retained respect. By February 1914, she was a veteran of countless crossings, and winter crossings were a different breed. Ice gathered along rails, wind carved through rigging, waves struck with cold authority. Yet schedules remained firm. The Atlantic did not excuse delay. On February 6, 1914, Oceanic departed Queenstown for New York, a routine voyage, familiar waters. The storm began gradually. Winds intensified through the night. By morning, heavy seas rolled beneath her hull. Spray froze along deck edges. Some passengers remained in cabins battling nausea. Others gathered indoors, listening to the wind's rising howl. But the crew was not alarmed. Oceanic had endured worse. By the afternoon of February 12, 1914, the North Atlantic had settled into a dangerous rhythm. The sky was iron gray, low and oppressive. Wind screamed across the superstructure, tearing at loose canvas and rattling every exposed surface. Waves no longer rolled in orderly procession. They collided, merged, and broke in unpredictable bursts of white fury. Yet inside, life persisted. In the first-class smoking room, a handful of gentlemen debated politics and business prospects in New York. In the saloon, stewards steadied crystal glasses as lunch service continued with admirable precision. Below decks, engineers monitored the triple expansion engines, their steady thrum a reassuring heartbeat beneath the chaos. Captain's orders had already been issued to secure exposed areas. Watertight doors checked, storm shutters fastened. Oceanic pressed forward. Unlike the later giants such as RMS Titanic or RMS Olympic, Oceanic belonged to an earlier generation of Atlantic leviathans. Her hull lines cut deeply into heavy seas rather than riding high above them. That trait made her steady, but it also meant she met waves head-on. And that afternoon, the Atlantic prepared something different. Shortly after 3 o'clock, a subtle tension rippled through the ship. Officers on the bridge later described it not as a sight at first, but a feeling. The regular rhythm of wave crests ahead seemed to flatten. The horizon darkened unevenly. One lookout leaned forward. What he saw defied expectation. A mass of water higher than surrounding seas was rising, not from a sequence of waves, but alone, a singular elevation, a mound becoming a wall. There was no time to turn sharply. In heavy seas, drastic maneuvers could expose the vessel broadside to even greater danger. The helm adjusted slightly. Engines maintained power. The bridge braced. And then it struck. The sound was not a crash, but an explosion. Water slammed into Oceanic's starboard bow with such force that steel plating flexed inward. The promenade deck vanished beneath a cascade of green-black water. Glass shattered across first-class cabins. A section of outer plating fractured and torn loose, hurling fragments inward like shrapnel. Passengers were thrown from chairs. A steward collided with a bulkhead. In one cabin, a seasick passenger lying in his berth watched in frozen disbelief as a twisted shard of steel punched through the wall and lodged inches from his head. The ship heaved violently to port. For several seconds, the roar of water overwhelmed every other sound. It surged along deck, slammed into fittings, and drained away in torrents. Then came the silence. Not complete silence, but the stunned quiet that follows shock. Engine vibrations continued. The hull held. Oceanic had not capsized, but she had been wounded. Crew rushed to inspect damage. Shattered windows gaped open to freezing wind. Bent stanchions littered the deck. A section of plating near the bow had split under the pressure. Water had forced its way into forward spaces before drainage systems caught up. Miraculously, there were no fatalities. Incredibly, there were few serious injuries. But what had struck them was no ordinary breaker. Sailors spoke in hushed tones of freak seas, a wave that rose from nowhere, higher than logic allowed, stronger than structural expectation. The term rogue wave did not yet belong to maritime vocabulary in 1914, but Oceanic had just met one. The Atlantic had reminded her, reminded all aboard, that even the most seasoned liner remains at the mercy of forces not fully understood. And the voyage was not yet over. The storm raged on as Oceanic pressed westward. By mid-afternoon, the sky was a relentless sheet of gray, the sea a heaving expanse of whitecaps and black troughs. Ice clung to railings, ropes, and fittings. The wind ripped across decks, carrying the taste of brine and snow, biting through coats and scarves, stinging cheeks, and freezing any exposed skin. Passengers were still inside, some shaken, some trying to maintain composure. On the upper decks, the promenade was almost deserted. Chairs and benches had been secured, and railings were slick with spray. A handful of onlookers pressed their hands against window panes, watching the violent dance of the waves, feeling both awe and unease. Below decks, the hum of the engines remained a steady counterpoint to the chaos outside. Engineers monitored every gauge, every pressure reading, knowing that even the smallest malfunction in these conditions could spell disaster. Crewmen ran along the passageways, checking doors, lashing items down, moving with urgency, yet maintaining a calm professionalism. Then, as if the Atlantic itself had decided to test its supremacy, the next wave arrived. It appeared silently at first, a subtle swelling beyond the horizon, but grew with alarming speed. Officers on the bridge exchanged hurried glances, instinctively sensing the enormity of what approached. It was not part of the storm's regular pattern. It rose taller than its predecessors, a vertical wall of deep green water, capped with frothy white spray. The wave seemed to hang for a heartbeat, a monstrous, impossible shadow. Passengers below would later recount a sense of premonition, a brief pause in the wind, a sudden hush, a lurch through the decks that felt unnatural. Then it hit. The first impact was explosive. Water cascaded over the starboard bow, smashing against the promenade deck with a deafening roar. The sheer force ripped open shutters and splintered window frames, hurling fragments across cabins and hallways. Furniture overturned. Stewards and passengers were thrown to the floor. A metallic, wet smell filled the air, mingling with salt and the acrid tang of coal from the boiler rooms. C.A. Cajun, confined to his berth by seasickness, barely had time to react. The steel shutter pierced the oak of his bed frame, grazing him by inches. On deck, 9 passengers scrambled as the torrent surged past, fighting to maintain their footing on the slippery surface. Thomas Meredith and Harry Snyder clutched railings, nearly swept overboard by the relentless force. One man became trapped between ventilators, water pushing him sideways, yet somehow he remained upright. The ship groaned under the pressure. Beams flexed, bulkheads shivered, and for a few terrifying seconds, the Atlantic seemed poised to claim its victory. But Oceanic did not yield. Her engineers adjusted the engines. Her hull, built for endurance, flexed but held. Water flowed off the decks as quickly as it had arrived, leaving chaos in its wake. Shattered glass glimmered in the weak winter sunlight, dripping with salt water. Passengers and crew alike stood frozen, hearts pounding, breathing unevenly, staring at the damage and at the sea that had just revealed its power. Even after the wave passed, the atmosphere remained tense. There was no applause, no sigh of relief, only the heavy, awed silence of those who had glimpsed the sea's unfathomable strength. The Atlantic had delivered a reminder. No vessel, no matter how great, is immune to its sudden fury. After the first impact, the Atlantic did not relent. The storm's fury continued to lash Oceanic, waves hammering against the bow, gusts ripping across decks, and the wind whistling through broken window panes. Ice formed along the exposed railings, clinging like frozen fingers, threatening to topple the unwary. The ship pitched and rolled, a massive steel beast wrestling with a sea that seemed alive, determined, merciless. The passengers were shaken but resilient. Those who had witnessed the first wave carried themselves with newfound caution, gripping handrails, clinging to walls, or staying low to steady themselves against sudden jolts. In the first-class cabins, the air was thick with salt, the metallic tang of water mingling with the faint scent of heated wood and upholstery dampened by spray. In the third-class quarters, families huddled together, children crying quietly, while mothers whispered assurances, their hands trembling from cold and fear. Crewmen moved methodically, yet with urgency, patching minor breaches, securing loose furnishings, and attending to minor injuries. Every step was calculated, every movement a balance between caution and necessity. They were the lifeline of the ship, the thin thread holding order against the overwhelming power of nature. Then, as the second wave arrived, unlike the first, it did not announce itself. It materialized from the horizon like a phantom, taller and steeper than any normal swell. Officers on the bridge shouted commands, engines throttled, and rudder adjustments were made, but the laws of physics allowed little room for maneuver. When it struck, it tore through the bow with astonishing force. The promenade deck was again submerged, glass shattered once more, furniture overturned, and the relentless roar of water drowned every other sound. Water poured into cabins as it raced across hallways, forcing passengers to leap or be swept away. Some clutched onto door frames, others onto fellow passengers. Every second stretched, every heartbeat felt prolonged, each one a gamble between survival and disaster. C.A. Cajun's cabin was again near the center of the chaos. The splintered shutter from the previous wave had been hastily cleared, but new debris arrived with the second torrent. The bed frame shook, a shard of steel nearly striking him once more. On deck, passengers who had survived the first wave found themselves thrown into positions that tested their balance, strength, and instinct. Every small misstep could have been fatal. The ship groaned audibly, steel beams bending imperceptibly under the pressure. Water cascaded down stairwells, pooling in corners and flooding hallways. Crew and passengers alike were soaked, shivering, hearts hammering. The Atlantic was not just a body of water, it was a living force, relentless and unforgiving. And then, as suddenly as it had arrived, the second wave receded, leaving chaos in its wake. Broken glass, torn furnishings, soaked clothing, and stunned faces everywhere. The smell of salt and wet timber lingered heavily in the air. Crew immediately began to assess damage, check for injuries, and restore order. Passengers clung to railings, their breaths heavy, their eyes wide with shock. Despite the violence, Oceanic remained intact. Her hull had held, her engines roared steadily. Her design, engineered for endurance, not for speed, had absorbed forces that could have shattered lesser ships. But more than the steel and design, it was the crew's precision, the passengers' resilience, and a measure of luck that had kept tragedy from escalating into catastrophe. The Atlantic, in its boundless, unpredictable power, had struck, and it had revealed the thin line between survival and disaster. Oceanic had endured, but the memory of those massive vertical walls of water would linger in the minds of every soul aboard, a stark reminder that at sea nothing is predictable, and even the greatest ships are merely visitors to the ocean's dominion.
The storm did not immediately relent as Oceanic continued her voyage westward. The horizon was a sheet of gray, broken only by the white peaks of waves that seemed to grow taller with every passing moment. The wind cut through clothing and flesh alike, carrying with it the briny sting of the North Atlantic. The ship's decks were slick with a mixture of sea spray and melting ice, each step a challenge. Inside, life tried to maintain its rhythm. Passengers huddled in corridors or cabins, whispering reassurances to one another. Children clutched at their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed and shivering. Stewards moved carefully, balancing trays, clearing debris, and checking on the injured, their faces set in grim lines of concentration. The creak of beams and the distant pounding of the hull reminded everyone that beneath them, the ship was straining against forces far beyond human control. Captain Harry Smith, standing resolutely on the bridge, scanned the rolling horizon. His eyes, hardened from years at sea, betrayed a flicker of tension. Every decision mattered. A misjudged turn, a delayed throttle adjustment, a minor miscalculation, any could have sent the vessel broadside into disaster. Yet Oceanic's design, coupled with the crew's expertise, allowed her to weather the storm. Below decks, the engines roared with steadfast determination. The vibrations coursed through the ship's frame, a constant reminder that power alone was not enough. It had to be guided, directed, restrained. Every valve, every piston, every bolt had been built for moments like these, moments when the Atlantic revealed both its beauty and its wrath. As the afternoon wore on, the passengers slowly began to regain composure, surveying the damage and the chaos left behind by the rogue waves. Shattered glass, twisted steel, and drenched furnishings littered cabins and promenades alike. The sound of water draining from decks and stairwells mixed with the muttered chatter of the shaken travelers. In cabins, those who had been tossed from chairs or thrown against bulkheads tended to minor injuries with the aid of stewards and fellow passengers. The Atlantic had tested the Oceanic's limits, and in doing so, revealed the narrow margin between survival and catastrophe. 7 injuries, no fatalities, and yet a profound, almost palpable respect for the power that had struck them. Every heart aboard thumped in recognition that the ocean's might was neither predictable nor forgiving. Even as the storm began to show signs of waning, the tension lingered. Every swell, every gust of wind reminded passengers that their ordeal was not over. The Atlantic could return at any moment to claim its due. And for the men and women who had felt the impact of those monstrous waves, the sea had left an indelible mark, a memory of raw power that would haunt them long after they set foot on solid ground. As the hours passed, the storm gradually began to relent, though the Atlantic remained restless. Waves continued to strike with relentless rhythm, though none approached the terrifying height of the rogue wall that had shattered cabins and thrown passengers from decks. The wind's howl softened only slightly, a constant reminder that the ocean's mood could shift again without warning. Crew and passengers alike moved carefully across the decks. Every step was a negotiation with the slippery, frozen surfaces. Ice clung to railings and rigging like frozen claws, threatening to topple anyone who misjudged a movement. Stewards, their uniforms drenched and stiff with cold, guided passengers from one secure area to another, murmuring reassurances while suppressing their own exhaustion. The engineers in the engine room worked tirelessly, monitoring pressures and ensuring that the heartbeat of the ship, the triple expansion engines, remained steady despite the shock waves of the previous impacts. Below decks, the hum of machinery and the occasional creak of stressed beams provided a background soundtrack to the silent tension that gripped the vessel. Passengers, now aware of how close the Atlantic had come to claiming lives, moved cautiously, whispering in low tones. Children clutched at their parents' skirts, wide-eyed and shivering. The elderly, some of whom had survived previous storms, stared out at the gray, heaving expanse, a mixture of awe and fear etched across their faces. The rogue wave had left its mark. Several cabins bore the scars of splintered wood and shattered glass. Furniture was overturned, upholstery soaked, floors slippery with seawater. On deck, twisted metal and dislodged fittings gleamed under the pale winter light. And yet, amid the wreckage, there was relief. Oceanic's hull had remained intact,
The ship's integrity, tested to its limit, had held. Captain Harry Smith stood on the bridge, eyes scanning the horizon. Every decision, every adjustment of the helm, every command to the engines had been measured with precision. Oceanic had endured not just because of steel and timber, but because of the human hands that guided her and the instinct, discipline, and courage of her crew. In the aftermath, passengers slowly ventured back onto the promenade deck, taking in the vast, roiling Atlantic. Their faces reflected exhaustion and wonder, the knowledge that they had glimpsed something extraordinary, something terrifying, and yet survived. The Atlantic had reminded them of its supremacy, but also, paradoxically, of the resilience of human ingenuity and the fortitude of those who navigate. Oceanic's journey continued, eventually reaching New York without further incident, encased in ice and bearing the story of that day. The encounter would later be cited as one of the earliest well-documented examples of a rogue wave striking a large ocean liner, a phenomenon that until then had existed largely in sailors' tales. It was a stark reminder that no matter how advanced the engineering, no matter how experienced the crew, the ocean remained an unpredictable force. It was both beautiful and deadly, awe-inspiring and humbling. And on that winter day in 1914, the RMS Oceanic had faced it head-on and survived, leaving behind a story of strength, courage, and the thin line between survival and catastrophe. The Atlantic, relentless and eternal, had tested her, and she had endured.